example of Venezuela. I think generally the question of state or non-state, well, the left believed for a hell of time that it's like take over the state and then change everything. It's quite obvious that it didn't work that way. But on the other hand, I also think that the alternative is just the movements, don't care about the state, don't get engaged with the state that came up like from the 80s on, also didn't work. Because the state doesn't allow you to build autonomy and just keeps looking and waiting that you do your own thing and just decide not to respect the state or just take everything from the state. So I think the question is complicated and contradictory, but how can we, so I think definitely the state is not going to change things because the state is a product of capitalism, so it can't bring up the new. But the other question is, if you don't have the state, you will never have even the spaces to start bringing up the new. Or you can bring it up, but as soon as it gets a bit more important, it's going to be crushed by the state. So that's the big contradiction, I think, we have to work with. And that people know that. It's not that people are idiots. People know that, and so people usually don't get involved into movements if they don't see a slightest chance that the movement might win or at least gain something. Apart if they're lunatics like we are, I spent like 32 years of my life in movements that 99% got defeated, but we can't expect the whole world to be like we are. So most of the people don't get involved if they don't see really any chance that to win. Some religious people might, but the rest not. So, and the other question is also, I think it depends also very much, if we look at concrete situations, in Latin America, the absence of the state would mean that the corporations take over, for example. Because any corporation, multinational corporation, transnational corporation in the world has got much more power than any state in the global south. So getting rid of the state would mean that probably some corporations would take over, and I don't think really that would be much better than having the state. I think it would be, in fact, much worse. Or we could say the same question here in the US. What about, okay, we have, even if we could build all autonomous spaces all over, etc., would that be enough if the government goes on taking war to all the rest of the world, but we are in happy autonomous spaces in the US? Or do we have to also change something with the state? In Venezuela, and that's where I think it's very interesting, since Chavez got elected in '98, the idea or the orientation of the movement as a whole is that it's supposed not to be the state that is changing things, but the state is supposed to be opening up spaces for the movements so that the movements can create the new. That's a nice idea. It obviously doesn't work always like that because there is an asymmetry of power, even if the state and the institutions declare that they want to open up spaces, or they are in fact opening up spaces for building the new, but you will always have the tension between a social logic and an institutional logic. The institutional logic is the one fitting into tables, and the social logic is the one not fitting into tables. So that's just a general contradiction. But I think it's a totally different starting point if, as a movement, you can say, look, the official political orientation that is there is that we are the ones creating the new things and not the institutions. And that's also the question of autonomy. Then when I'm talking about autonomy, I want to make sure that it's not autarky. It does not mean that you're doing everything on your own. It means that you discuss, that you have the spaces to discuss on your own, that you can keep your own agenda, and that you make up your agenda. But it does not mean that you don't need any support, any help, any connection to whatever, other groups, institutions, state, etc. So if we look at the history, and to make clear the importance, if we look at the history of Venezuela, in '89 there was this big uprising, the Caracazo, when the population, after a decade of really harsh impoverishment and neoliberal politics, had a big uprising that started in Caracas and spread over the whole country, where people started looting everything, but there was no really organized structure to build an alternative structure during the uprising. So what happened? The uprising went on for a week. It's even said that the government flew outside the country and had the army repressing the people. And after a week, the people, well, also between 3,000 and 4,000 deaths probably, and then people went home because there was nothing they had built as an alternative structure, and the government came back, and everything seemed like before. It was not like before because it was an important break. People suddenly realized if we get together, we can even just chase out the government. And that was the starting point for getting organized and starting organized in a different way. Then there was, in '92, there have been two military coups, one organized by Chavez's organization, another one by another leftist organization inside the army. Both failed. They were not just military coups, they were in connection with rank and file organizations from the poor neighborhoods, with smaller guerrilla groups, with other political organizations, etc., but both failed. But what that made up, like people first learned, if we are all together, we can even kick out the government. Secondly, we're not alone. We have a big part of the army that will not turn against us, but is supporting us. And I'm telling that that's important for the perspective that people had, because you had more or less the same level of struggles between '89 and '92 in the Dominican Republic, like in Venezuela. And the Dominican Republic turned out into nothing. And Venezuela turned out into huge movements and into progressive government opening up spaces, contradictory like they are. But that makes, I think, shows how important it is also that people have some kind of idea that they might succeed with what they're doing. And it's not a totally lunatic thing that they engage in or whatever. So what happened then? From '98 on, the idea was, from '99, got in charge Chavez, the idea was, okay, the state is supposed to be opening up the spaces and the rank and files are trying to build up the new. During the first years, the idea was, okay, we try to reform the institutions, we do the change from the institutions, we create spaces where rank and files and institutions work together to create some alternatives. It didn't work. So we can say that from 2005 on, more or less, the idea has been create parallel institutions to the institutions that exist. And these institutions are not integrated into the representative framework, institutional framework, but are really parallel. But they get their funding from the state and from the institutions to set up their own, what they want, and they have their own agenda. On that basis, first the so-called communal councils were created. That's a structure that people organize in neighborhoods. Usually it's about 10 families in indigenous areas, 20 in rural areas, between 150 and 400 in urban areas. It means if we're living like in the same neighborhood, we can call the first assembly of the neighborhood. If like 20% of the people show up, then we decide what is the territory of our communal council. Once we have that, we decide what working commissions do we have. The working commissions can be whatever, culture, alternative economy, sports, maybe neighborhood radio we have, or whatever. And then the whole community elects spokespeople. For every working commission, one spokesperson. That indicates it's a spokesperson. It can't decide anything, the person. The idea is that the decisions, so the work is done in the work commissions. The work commissions have to present their proposals and their work to the neighborhood assembly. It's the neighborhood assembly that decides about the priorities, what projects to engage in, and if they're okay or not what the work commissions did. And the spokespeople are the ones taking these decisions to other levels, to institutions, etc. But not allowed to decide anything. The next steps to introduce, and I will stop after that, is the idea that if in a certain area, for example, you have like, usually it's in cities between 10 and 30 communal councils, and in rural areas much less because the area is bigger, you can found a so-called commune, a socialist commune, that means that you have the next level of decision, but all decisions are still taken by the neighborhood assembly of all communal councils, but you can engage into bigger projects. There's one thing they're doing right now is setting up so-called communal cooperatives. That means that there are cooperatives, but they're not owned by the workers that work there, but by the whole community that decides what kind of enterprise shall we set up, who should work there, and what do we do with these enterprises. That's something they do a lot now on a communal level. And the next level is the communal city, that is supposed to be an area with various communas that can then build a so-called communal city. The decisions are still taken from the neighborhood assembly of the communal councils and brought up by spokespeople to the other levels. That's the idea. It's a direct, not representative democracy, and it's totally parallel to the existing representative system that still exists. As Venezuela is still a capitalist system, capitalist state, and a representative democracy. It's not easy to get rid of representative democracy without getting bombed nowadays, so it probably will be there still for quite a time. I will engage with the contradictions that anyway exist, obviously, in this, because of the asymmetry of power in the discussion later. Thanks.